Today, we have one more lecture in our joint lecture series, Making Sense of the Post-COVID World, Continuities and Changes. Today, we're going to count with Professor Sara Stevano from SOAS, University of London in Britain, and she'll talk about labor inequalities during and after the pandemic. Mariana Cavalcante in Rio will introduce Professor Stevano to the audience and to the people who are going to watch the video afterwards. Mariana, please.
Thank you, Mauricio. Good afternoon to all. It is truly a pleasure this afternoon, in Rio at least, to welcome Professor, Sara Stevano, who is a development and feminist political economist. She's a senior lecturer, actually, in economics at SOAS at the University of London, and she has held teaching and research positions at the University of the West of England, at Bristol and King's College London. Her areas of study are the political economy of labor, food and social reproduction. Her work focuses on Africa with primary research experience in Mozambique and Ghana. Welcome so much, Sara. It is truly a pleasure to have you here with us this afternoon.
Thank you so much to all of you for organizing this lecture series, and it's really a pleasure to have the opportunity to have this conversation with you. So if that is okay, I'm going to move straight into my presentation. I'm going to share my screen. I've prepared some slides. I cannot, okay. You cannot see the full, okay, there you go. Can you see the full screen? Perfect.
Yes.
Yesterday I had a bit of a problem, but I think it's working. It should be fine. Okay, so the presentation that I have prepared for today is about COVID-19 as a pandemic of inequalities. And I will be looking primarily at issues of work and social reproduction as key lenses through which I think we can understand how inequalities have been magnified and reproduced during the COVID-19 pandemic. So to do so, I draw on essentially 3 papers, and I know that probably you've seen one of these 3 papers. A couple of these papers are more conceptual, so all of this work is collective work, and I would like to acknowledge all of my co-authors. I'm not going to name them because it's actually quite a few of them. So a couple of these papers are a bit more conceptual, and then another paper brings together theory with a more empirical investigation of essential work as a category that has been used particularly during the first phase of the pandemic by governments to, sort of restructure in some ways the workforce on a global scale. And I will say something about this. But in essence, so the purpose of the presentation is to provide a bit of a conceptual framework to think about the reproduction of inequalities during the pandemic, and then to conclude with some questions for what a feminist post-pandemic future might look like at the very end. So I would like to start with this narrative that I think we've all come across, particularly in the early phases of the pandemic. We are all in this together. So I put on the slide a couple of key interventions in the early phases of the pandemic by Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the UN. And also maybe for this audience, you're not very familiar with somebody called Rishi Sunak, but he's the Chancellor of the Exchequer in the UK government. And so like a key politician in the Tory party, in the Tory government in the UK. And he was somebody who talked about this idea that we're all in this together quite a few times at the beginning of the pandemic. Now, I think it is quite obvious to all of us here that this narrative was incredibly flawed in that it's completely misleading to think about the COVID-19 pandemic in this way, in the sense that, yes, in theory, COVID as a disease can hit anybody in the same way, but in fact, in practice, we know that things have been very different. And I think this was quite clear right from the start of the pandemic. And so here I'm sharing some newspaper headlines or the headlines from some reports that actually were published quite early on in the pandemic. So I collected this material in between February and April 2020, more or less. And so we can see that from a gender perspective, back then there was already quite some awareness as well as emerging evidence that the pandemic was having significant gendered impacts, both in terms of the parallel pandemic of domestic violence that particularly women were exposed to as people spent more time in their homes, but also the issue of care burdens and social reproduction work that was taken up primarily by women in households, although on this perhaps more data would be useful in order, more systematic data would be useful in order to make this claim, but this was, early days. And so on and so forth. I will expand a little bit on this later, but it was clear that there are some important gender dynamics that were going on here. And in fact, it wasn't only about gender. But from the beginning, it was already clear that ethnic minorities were being hit by the virus disproportionately, and that there were also some class dynamics, particularly in relation to employment and the type of occupations that people had. And so through the months and the years, a lot of evidence has emerged that I think put us in a position to talk quite confidently about a pandemic of inequalities. And here I wanted to underline how I think it is very important that we understand inequality in the plural. And this is probably something that is particularly relevant for people working in my own discipline, which is economics. Because economists have a tendency to focus on income or wealth inequality, but they don't have a very good record of looking at other types of inequalities. And the reason why I think it is important to look at inequalities in the plural is that, for example, if we look at what happened to income inequality during the pandemic, I think the first study that looked at this issue on a global level that was published in early 2021 was by Angus Deaton, who is a Nobel laureate for economics. And this study suggested that global income inequality in the first year of the pandemic, which is essentially from January 2020 to December 2020, had decreased. And the main mechanism behind this decrease in global income inequality is that richer countries were worse hit by the pandemic, particularly in that first year, and that resulted in large GDP losses, so large economic losses in richer countries than if compared with poorer countries. And I mean, I think, this is, I think, important information to have. And this was clearly something that happened at the beginning of the pandemic that really escaped the sort of rich-poor divides or the South-North divides in how countries responded to the public health emergency. So perhaps some had an expectation that richer countries or more advanced economies, so-called, would have been better prepared to respond to the pandemic, but in fact they weren't. And at least in that phase, that led to a decrease in global income inequality. But I think this is a very clear example as to why to stop our exploration of inequality at the level of income is clearly insufficient to think about inequalities more broadly. And so to just capture this with key stylized facts, I think we can see how there has been an intensification of gender inequality, and there is this interesting sort of puzzle here that women seem to be less affected than men in terms of COVID-19 infection and mortality. But then in the end, they were disproportionately affected because they are, or were also overrepresented among those who became unemployed during the pandemic, those who shouldered the increased care workloads, and also they were exposed to the increased risk of domestic violence. Now, again, another stylized fact about racial inequality, for which I think there is a lot of evidence by now, is that racial inequality was heightened. And there is particularly good evidence that shows that ethnic minorities were affected in terms of prevalence, hospitalization, and mortality rates disproportionately in comparison with people from other racial backgrounds, particularly in countries such as the US, the UK, and Brazil. And finally, also class inequality. I think overall, the idea is that class inequality has been widening, and this in some ways has to do with how the wealthiest, so the top 1% or the top 10% were able to work from not only from home, but from their second homes. The middle classes were able to work from home, and in some cases they had, however, to take up a greater social reproduction burdens within their homes. And finally, the working classes were either classified as essential or faced unemployment. And I think these dynamics are very important, and perhaps future research will be needed in this direction to find out exactly what is happening in the aftermath of the pandemic or in later phases of the pandemic. But so does it mean that we are now beyond we are all in this together narrative? So I think, at least from my perspective, and I would be very interested in knowing what others think about this, but at least in the rhetoric, I haven't heard much of this anymore in more recent times. And I think this is clearly it has to do with the fact that we now have a lot of evidence on the uneven impacts of COVID. And there is probably also an increasing awareness that the COVID-19 crisis in a way intervened in a world that was already very unequal and exposed some of the pre-existing inequalities and fragilities that were already there. There have also been some important pushbacks against this we are all in this together narrative, although I would consider these pushbacks a little bit unhelpful, and I will explain why. So, for example, in the field of development studies or development economics, there has been a call from influential development scholars to say, well, absolutely, the COVID-19 pandemic was not about we're all in this together, because, of course, we have seen a lot of inequality. But in fact, inequality is a global issue. It's not something that pertains only to the so-called global South. And therefore, what we should embrace is a global development paradigm where we concern ourselves with issues of poverty and inequality on a global scale, and we abandon as a type of analytical framework the North-South divides. So towards the end of the presentation, I will say a little bit more about why I think that the global development paradigm is actually not very helpful. But it is clear that in claiming that there is inequality and therefore we're not all in this together, but inequality cuts across global South and global North, then there is a risk of undermining the structural importance of South-North divides, which instead I think have been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, and later I'll explain why. But there have also been some very different voices. For example, Bill Gates, I think, recently published a new book, which is about how to prevent future pandemics, which is very much focused on technical solutions. So there is an acknowledgement that something went a bit wrong in the way in which we responded to the COVID-19 pandemic. So we need to do better in the future. But the way in which we get there is through things such as better contact tracing systems and better systems of vaccine development, which of course, goes nowhere near addressing some of the structural issues that underpin some of the most important causes and dynamics of the COVID-19 pandemic. And in any case, so even if it seems that the "we are all in this together" narrative has been somewhat abandoned, I think there is evidence, and again, this is based on the review of policy responses in the first year of the pandemic, more or less, that the responses up to that point did not do anything to alter the pre-pandemic configurations of power, and if anything, they have further exacerbated them. So with colleagues, we have somehow thought about doing some work, and I don't think that we went, I think the journey is still in progress, but we wanted to come up with a conceptual framework that allows us to understand the reproduction of inequalities, not in isolation, but through their interconnections, and also to see how inequalities are reproduced at multiple scales. And in a way, it is based on this type of conceptual framing that we can craft a vision for a feminist post-pandemic future that really puts all of us in this together. Okay, so what I would like to say now is a couple of words about the nature of the COVID-19 crisis, which is a crisis that in many ways is quite different, for example, from the 2008 global financial crisis. And so with colleagues, we have defined this crisis as a crisis of capitalism, but not in the sense that it has put capitalism in crisis, but more in the sense that it is a crisis that is generated within capitalism. And then again, this might be an important point to make, particularly in the context of economics, where many economists more on the mainstream side of things have understood the COVID-19 pandemic as an exogenous shock, right? So something that has to do with health. It doesn't have anything to do with the economy as such. And so it's exogenous to the functioning of the economic system. But from our perspective, this is absolutely not the case. The COVID-19 crisis is all to do with capitalism and the contemporary form of capitalism that we have. So indeed, there is a lot of research that looks specifically at how zoonotic transmission has been heightened by the intensification of agriculture and livestock in the context of an agri-food system that is a capitalist one on a global scale. Also, the COVID-19 crisis is certainly not only a health kind of issue, but in fact, from the very beginning, it was a health, social, and economic crisis all at once, to the point that it has been defined as a syndemic and not as a pandemic, for example, by Richard Horton, who is the editor-in-chief of The Lancet. And bringing a sort of feminist social reproduction lens to this, I think is quite important to see the COVID-19 crisis as being fundamentally a crisis of work. So what happened is that the ways in which we organize both production and reproduction, so both productive work and reproductive work, were profoundly disrupted during this crisis. And these disruptions were due, on the one hand, to the health impacts, so to the physical illness of labor, where in fact we've also realized once again that workers are not individuals that sort of enter the labor market in isolation, but they are people who are embedded in a social context, and therefore there are also some very important dynamics that take place, particularly at the level of the household, in terms of the people that we live with and how the illness of labor links to the people we live with. And on the other hand, productive and reproductive work were disrupted due to various policy impacts. So starting with the intensification of social reproduction work, the categorization of the workforce into essential and non-essential, and also the disruption of global supply chains. So in this sense, the COVID-19 crisis can be understood as a magnifying glass, which has exposed and magnified pre-existing inequalities that are reproduced through the organization of life and work, both at the level of households and in the world of work. And what is important is that what happens at the level of households and in the world of work is deeply interconnected. Again, this is something that is very clear from a feminist perspective, because from a feminist viewpoint, work is not only productive work to start with, there is also reproductive work, but also the two are basically part of the same continuum going from production to reproduction. And therefore, it is important to understand how COVID shaped the organization of work at the intersections between productive and reproductive work. So with this in mind, I want to now speak a little bit about what happened in households and what happened in the world of work. And I will try to connect, again, I'm talking about broad trajectories. What was happening at the level of households prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, and then how the COVID-19 pandemic intervened on that system and level of analysis, and then the same for the world of work. So in terms of households, there is a lot of particularly feminist scholarship that prior to COVID that documented how during the phase of neoliberalism, so we're talking about from the 1980s more or less up to today, and now we are clearly in a transitioning moment, it's not clear where we're going to go. But in this historical period, households households became increasingly responsible for welfare provisioning. And so to make a bit of a simplification, there are different patterns, I think, that are relevant for the global north and the global south. So in the global north, the literature is primarily focused on the retreat of the state. So a state that was more present in the 1950s and 60s. And that after that became less present, so withdrew itself from the provision of basic social services in particular. And that led to a process of privatization of social reproduction, where essentially households and families became more responsible for their own welfare and well-being provisioning in that context. Now, I think in the global south, the trajectory is a little bit different because even though I think even in many contexts of the global south, the state was more present in the 1950s and 60s, but it never reached the level, for example, of the formation of a welfare system. So in a way, social reproduction had always been much more family-centered in many contexts of the global south. But during the phase of neoliberalism, there has been a complication and fragmentation of social reproduction that has to do with many things, but to mention just a couple, it has to do with processes of urbanization, for example, on the one hand, and how families now live in different places, despite, again, remaining responsible primarily for social reproduction. And also we've seen a fragmentation of labor markets where people have to do a number of different occupations in order to make a living, and that leads to this process of fragmentation of the means of social reproduction. And then we have this cross-cutting process of financialization where households and families being responsible themselves for welfare provisioning, in many cases, they need to become indebted in order to pay for access to certain social services. And indeed, there is very interesting literature on household indebtedness also that speaks to these issues. But so the point is that during the era of neoliberalism or neoliberal globalization, inequalities increased between households and also within households. So between households, what matters most is socioeconomic inequalities that have to do with income and class. And within households, we can think more about gender inequalities and what it meant, particularly from a gender perspective, when more social reproduction work is taken up by households. Who's going to do that? And we know that the answer is that in the vast majority of cases, these people are women and children. Now, what happened during the COVID-19 pandemic? So this is where households were, to paint a very broad picture, before the COVID-19 crisis hit. So when the crisis hit, what happened? What happened was nothing particularly new, but a very significant intensification of social reproduction work taking place in households. And this was due to not only, very clearly, this happened in places where lockdown policies were implemented, but also school closures contributed to this. The disrupted mobility that came with the inability of crossing national borders, for example, or moving around freely within a specific country, placed the household at the center of the responses to the pandemic. And of course, what is important is that because we saw how inequalities were already on the rise during this historical phase of neoliberalism, then the household impacts were differentiated on a number of grounds. And perhaps to mention the most important ones, we can mention the location of the household in the social division of labor, and this has to do with the socioeconomic characteristics and class characteristics. But also the impacts were differentiated by household composition, living arrangements, and care responsibilities by members of the household, the position of the household in terms of wealth and debt, so particular assets that the household had or didn't have, in fact. And then impacts were also differentiated by the occupation of household members. And so what happened is that through this reorganization of primarily, but not exclusively, reproductive work taking place in the household, inequalities between and within households were exacerbated. Now, moving to the world of work, again, so what was happening in the face of neoliberalism in the world of work can be summarized by this growing process of precarization in the world of work on a global scale, to the point that some scholars have been talking about how it is clear that it is the West following the rest, not the other way around. So in a way that historical parenthesis that some countries in the global north experienced in the 1950s and 60s, where we saw an increase in types of employment that were permanent, stable, offered social security and so forth, was in fact not something that was eventually going to happen across the rest of the globe. It was just a matter of time. But what we see is essentially the reverse. So we see how processes of informalization and casualization of labor are emerging very strongly again in the global north, and in a way they have always been the most dominant forms of work across much of the global south. And what has also happened has to do with the organization of production and reproduction into global supply chains. And in the case of reproduction, we could be talking about global care chains, where working classes that are gendered and racialized in different ways have been adversely incorporated into these global supply chains, or in fact, again, on grounds of class, gender, and race, have been expelled from global production networks and therefore live at the margins of these global production networks, which comes with a lot of problems and a lot of fragmentation when it comes to social reproduction again. And so we see how, there has been a consolidation of these gendered and racialized hierarchies in global classes of labor that did not start during the neoliberal era, but was, progressed in many ways during the neoliberal era. And what happened during the COVID-19 pandemic in this context was this fundamental reorganization of work based on a distinction between sectors of the economy defined as low-skilled but also essential, and other sectors of the economy defined as high-skilled but also considered to be non-essential. So there was this sudden shift from thinking about the forms of low-skilled work or even unskilled work as being essential work. And I think that there is something quite interesting on this, particularly from a feminist perspective. But in essence, what happens here in terms of inequalities is again through differentiated impacts, both in specific contexts, but also based on the location of specific forms of work or worker in global structures of production and reproduction. And I will expand a little bit on this just in a second, which I hope will make it a little bit clear what I mean by this. But again, you see that so even here, there is something a bit new when it comes to this distinction between essential and non-essential work. But in terms of inequalities, so we see a deepening process of inequalities among classes of labor, both locally and globally. But now, and this will be probably the last 10 minutes of the presentation, I would like to say a little bit more about essential work and then South-North divides from a work perspective. And the interesting thing of essential work is its, if you want, to double-edged nature, but also its biased nature in the way that governments across the world have been using these classifications, particularly in the early phases of the COVID-19 pandemic. So for a start, it is important to bear in mind that poor classes, women, people of color, migrants are all overrepresented among essential workers. And so in a way, I mean, this is something that I was much more optimistic on at the beginning of the pandemic. But I did see the potential for a significant transformative process in that sudden shift that entailed seeing low-skilled work as essential. And what was particularly interesting for me was that a lot of that low-skill but also essential work, of course it's not low-skill, but these are the sort of mainstream and dominant categorizations for it. So a lot of that work was effectively social reproduction work. So anything that had to do with food production and distribution, provision of health and education, and also social care. So again, from a feminist perspective, there was something, and I think there is still something to my mind, so I've become much less optimistic now, that this sudden operation of rebranding these forms of work as essential could actually hold a significant transformative potential. But of course, there were and there continue to be some key problems. The first is that, of course, being classified as an essential worker is positive in that, maybe the alternative would have been, and it has been for many people, to become unemployed. So, of course, by being declared an essential worker, many people were able to keep their job and continue to receive an income. So it was, in a way, a way of safeguarding their livelihoods. But at the same time, because government responses were, I think, in many contexts, really not good enough, these workers were much more exposed to the disease. So in that sense, there is a bit of a double-edged nature of essential work. But also in the ways in which governments have used these definitions, there are some important biases, and this is what that paper on essential work that I mentioned at the beginning did. It was basically, to highlight these biases, because in fact, not all essential workers were able to have their income protected during the pandemic. And very often these had to do with either the informal nature of work or the transnational nature of their work, which, for example, if you think about somebody working on in an agri-food chain, but at the origins of the chain in a country like Mozambique, even though their job was indeed by the government of Mozambique classified as essential, the fact that there were disruptions further along the chain meant that, in fact, the government of Mozambique could do very little in order to ensure that those workers continue to have their job and continue to receive an income during the pandemic. Okay, and that was very similar for not all, but many categories of informal workers. And the big, in fact, this is not only a bias, but it's a massive omission from a feminist perspective, is that the type of work that continue to be not recognized as essential in any way is a type of unpaid reproductive work that indeed was intensified within households, but that no government really took much care of in any way. And so you see how essentially the essential workers, I'm sorry for the for saying like too many essential there, but essential workers gained some social recognition during the pandemic. But I think so far, and I've been looking for this evidence, but so far there is no systematic evidence that they have made any material gains. And so many forms of essential work continue to be low paid, and many are precarious too. On this note, I would like to expand a little bit on the South-North divides from a work perspective, because a lot more could be said from other perspectives, but I'm not going to get into that. So in a way, the location of specific forms of work or worker in global production and reproduction structures and chains did make a difference in how workers were able to respond to the pandemic or absorb the impacts of the pandemic differently. And this is for a number of reasons. So, for example, if we think about, so the data is from 2020 in terms of working hours lost, show that the most significant losses happened in Latin America and the Caribbean, Southern Europe, and Southern Asia. So again, these impacts were different by location. the possibility of workers to organize their work from home were very different. So, for example, we go from 3% of workers on average in sub-Saharan Africa to 30% of workers who were able to shift their work from home in Europe and North America. And it is clear that there have been disproportionate effects on informal workers due to lack of social protection, lack of job security, and as I was saying before, often livelihoods were not protected, even if these workers were officially classified as essential. And also there were some disproportionate effects on workers at the origins of global supply chains, which reflect the power relations within supply chains and the ability of firms downstream to push the costs and the risks upstream along the chain. We know that in many African countries, for example, governments tried to upscale their cash transfer programs, but these were often not sufficient to significantly offset the negative effects on larger parts of the workforce in the global south. And so I just want to show, I'm not going to tell you much more about this, but I want to show you the sort of the visualization of the conceptual framework that I have been trying to describe, where essentially we wanted to capture how COVID-19 disrupted the organization of productive and reproductive work at the level of households and in global labor markets, and the impacts have been differentiated through a number of different channels, with the effect of reproducing and magnifying inequalities of gender, race, and class, which are a cross-cutting feature of all of this. And so to conclude, I would like to say just a couple of words on what this implies for the crisis of social reproduction. And this is something that I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but feminists have been talking about the ongoing crisis of social reproduction in capitalism that has to do with this intrinsic feature of capitalism to devalue social reproduction, while of course, although the system, the economic system needs a social reproduction. And so there is this intrinsic tendency, this contradiction, if you want, that tends to generate a crisis of social reproduction. And indeed, it is this long-term squeeze of social reproduction by which we can think both of unpaid and underpaid social reproduction work that is a key determinant of the perpetuation of inequalities of gender, race, and class. And the COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted and exacerbated the ongoing crisis of social reproduction, at least in two key ways. First, because it highlighted the need for socialization of social reproduction, by exposing the insufficiency of the household to meet all social reproduction needs. So this, for me, is fundamental. What we found out more clearly during the COVID-19 pandemic, although this is something that we somehow knew also before the COVID-19 pandemic, is that households are nowhere near sufficient to meet all of the social reproduction needs, or they cannot alone cater for all of the social reproduction imperatives. And so this was clearly exposed. And on the other hand, the COVID-19 pandemic also deepened the crisis of social reproduction through the increase of care needs and the devaluation of social reproduction work that so far has not been overturned. But I think here the picture is a little bit more complex because of those dynamics around essential social reproduction work. And so coming to the very last slide, and very briefly, I think that addressing some of these underlying mechanisms of the crisis of social reproduction that so far have not been, not only they have not been addressed in the responses to the COVID-19 pandemic, but in fact, in some ways they have been made worse. I think that thinking about a post-pandemic feminist future needs to have probably more than these 3 bullet points that I have here for sure, but I would think that these are 3 priorities from my perspective. One is the need to reclaim the meaning of essential work from a feminist perspective. The second is the importance of revaluing social reproduction work. And the third, is the importance of socializing social reproduction through the reappropriation of communal and public spaces that have been privatized, and also the provision of universal basic services. So on this note, I would like to thank you all for the attention. I hope that, I spoke for about 45 minutes, so I hope that's okay. Thank you for that. And I look forward to all of the questions and comments, of course.
Thank you very much, Sara, for this wonderful lecture. I think we have all profited very much from that. Now we're going to open for questions. Sergio Costa has already raised his hand on the screen. And Mariana as well. We have already questions from the students. So Sergio, please go ahead.
So thank you so much also from my side, Sara, for this really wonderful lecture, which actually gives a very nice overview. Nice, of course, in terms of clarity, not in terms of the political and analytical consequences, which was quite sad picture, but you know, to bring this in such clarity is really achievement. I have 2 questions which are somehow related to the lecture, but especially the second question goes beyond the lecture, because I know that you are also interested in this topic. The first question is related to your discussion on what has happened within households. And according to also many studies, but also our own studies, sorry, for instance, we have a colleague working on the consequences of the pandemic in Paraguay, but also we are also conducting with colleagues a comparative survey in different countries in Latin America. And what you saw there is a third, so to say, factor for providing welfare, not only family and state, but also communities, local communities. Therefore, I think especially during the pandemic, before the pandemic, but especially during the pandemic, this function of communities for providing welfare in any form, organizing collective money for the really very, very poor in the communities and so on, has been a crucial part of this scheme. Therefore, my question is if you also go into this and show how this is also perhaps a third factor in providing welfare. And the second question is connected with this North-South divide. And one aspect we didn't mention, but I think it has been also crucial, is the explosion of, let's say, digitalization, implying, I would say, a new wave of expropriation of knowledge, expropriation of data. In case of schools, it's quite clear how the existing technologies of learning, of teaching, were collected through, don't know, 3, 4 big companies, and now are used in applications and also sold to even to the public schools and so on. So, but also the explosion of platform capitalism as also a way of extracting data in really in mega proportions So therefore, if you go further on this to perhaps give some insights how this also affect North-South divides, especially taking into account that these companies are concentrated in the global North, and more than that, concentrated in US. Yeah.
Sara, please.
Okay, shall we do one by one?
Yes.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. Thank you so much, Sergio, for two very good questions, I think. So on your first question and the importance of the community, I think that this is a very crucial issue. And I am aware that in our conceptual framework that looks at households and the world of work, in a way there is a missing side and the level of analysis, which is indeed that of the community. And I think, and I think it is something that in certain contexts is certainly very relevant. In other contexts, less so. But then I think the same can be said for the household in a way. I think that the key difference is that so in the countries that implemented the strict lockdown policies, what was missing for at least some time was precisely the level of the community. And this was often quite short-lived in that maybe it lasted in the very early phases of strict lockdowns. And then in fact, it was reversed because there was a need for that kind of support that indeed came from the community. But I think the only thing I can say is that I completely agree with you, and I am aware that this is a missing dimension in our conceptual framework. And I think in part, it probably reflects a bit of a bias in feminist economics and feminist political economy, where a lot of work is focused indeed on households or labor markets. But I think that there are some important developments in that direction, and it is something that I should look more into in future research on these topics, because I think it's right. And I also want to take maybe this opportunity to say that much of this COVID-related research that I've done collaboratively took place in the very early phases of the pandemic. And in a way, also when I received the kind invitation to take part in this lecture, I was hoping that perhaps by now I would have been able to update that research, but unfortunately it has not happened. But I think in a way this reflects also the importance of continuing to do research on something that is still happening, because actually we're not kind of out of it. And I think things have changed significantly. Now, on the second question, yeah, I mean, I think that this is a very important issue, and it is, yeah, like I think you put it very nicely, you know, like it's yet another form of expropriation in a way that I think has become more important and more significant during the pandemic. It is not something that so far I have researched, but I would think that in the examination of those north-south divides is an important piece of the puzzle. And I mentioned in the presentation, I decided to focus on work issues because that was the overall scope. But I think that this issue of digitalization and the expropriation of data, with again, like with South-North dynamics, is one sort of dimension to add to the list, alongside the fact that, what are the other key dimensions? I think the role of the state, and how in many countries in the global north, the state was able, like they had a lot of fiscal capacity to intervene. But this was not the case for many countries of the global south, that not only face the fiscal constraints, but in fact now are facing very significant debt issues. And then until those structures of production change and countries in the global south can move away from being producers of primary or low value commodities, then I think that these dynamics of these divides and dynamics of dependence will somehow be perpetuated. And this issue of digitalization is yet another thing that exemplifies the perpetuation of North-South divides. So yeah, I'm sorry, I cannot say much more, but I think it's a very good point. Basically, that's it. Yeah.
Mariana, your turn.
Thank you, Mauricio. Well, thank you so much, Sara, for this really fantastic presentation. Well, one of the reasons why I'm so interested in what you're saying is that I'm an urban anthropologist, and I've been doing work on auto construction. So it's like I'm looking at households from a different scale and from a different perspective. So from the inside and from a bit much smaller perspective. So it was really enlightening to see that when you're looking at a larger scale, that many of the issues that we've been working on for so long suddenly come up with a pandemic, right? So I'm trying to think about, people who study infrastructure, especially in the global north, usually what people say is that, you only realize how important infrastructure is once it breaks down. And I think the pandemic did something like this to households and to this division, right, between the private and public, or between, what's inside the house and the public world, right? And so my first question to you is, since a pandemic brings to the fore these and to full-blown view these dynamics and inequalities that in a way were always there, but are transformed by the pandemic, and force other social scientists to look at these inequalities and issues, I'd like to ask you if you think the pandemic might have an impact on the sort of economic and mainstream social science research in order to incorporate these new dynamics and these new questions that came up with the pandemic. My second question for you is, it has to do, well, it also comes from an anthropologist, of course. I was really fascinated with the table that you present with the definitions of essential work across different countries. I think that was just really fantastic. And I think it's methodologically really, it was really smart of you guys to put together that table and to try to get at these differences through that table. So, and I'm sure that you thought that a lot more results came up that are probably not inside the papers that came out of the reading of that table. So I'd like you to comment a little bit more on that, because I think that as you move across these different places, and I mean, I'm sure that you needed a bunch of different researchers to put it together. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about that. And I'm pretty sure, but correct me if I'm wrong, that whatever you found from that table might be might be useful in moving us into interesting directions in terms of thinking through, in a feminist manner, most of these issues that we've been discussing this afternoon. So thank you very much.
Sara, your turn now again.
Yes, thank you so much, Mariana. Again, like another two very interesting questions. So the first one in particular is very interesting. Like, what are the impacts on this on mainstream economics or mainstream social science? It's a very difficult one, but I think I would say the following. So when it comes to the issue of inequality, already before the pandemic, I think that there was a bit of a shift, because particularly economists for a long time, they were just not interested in inequality, and because of the dominant economic thinking from basically the 1960s up to recently was suggesting that if you have maybe not very high levels of inequality, but some inequality, by which I mean income or wealth inequality in a country, that could even be beneficial to economic growth and economic development, because people, basically richer people, would use that wealth or that income in more productive ways, so that would be beneficial to the rest of society, to put it in very simple terms. So that was one view. And another view instead suggested, okay, maybe inequality is not great, but it's only a temporary issue. So, we will reach a point when with more economic growth and economic development, then inequality will disappear. And so for a long time, in fact, that's why, like, especially when we think about development processes, the attention has been very much on poverty reduction and not at all on inequality. And this was already beginning to shift prior to the pandemic, precisely because some people had already begun to realize that actually, inequality was on the rise and it was creating problems. So once again, I'm not sure that COVID is what actually did it, but I think it accelerated this process of recognition that certainly the issue of inequality is one that needs to be taken into consideration more seriously. But then, of course, I suppose that the usual warning and the usual caveat is around what are the implications of mainstreaming a concern for inequality. And then very often, I think that the solutions will tend to be probably more superficial than what is needed. And there is a danger in it. So now the International Monetary Fund is talking about inequality. But does it mean that they have changed their practice? So far, the evidence suggests that they haven't, right? So there are all of these risks and the continued existence of gaps between practice and rhetoric. So I can see some changes, basically, again, not necessarily triggered by COVID, but accelerated by COVID. But I'm not particularly hopeful on whether those changes can really lead to any more radical rethink of the economic system, which I think is what is probably needed in order not to find ourselves in a similar situation in the future. Now, coming to the second question on essential work, and thank you, this gives me the opportunity to tell you a little bit more about that essential work paper. And I'm glad that you found the idea that was actually, it was time consuming, but it was very straightforward, to see, okay, let's see what these different countries, how they used the classifications of essential work. And the motivation for this was that I think at the beginning, so certainly was the case for me, right? But I felt that it was something that many people bought into. When governments started talking about essential work, there was something quite intuitive that I think we all thought, or many of us at least thought, okay, yes, I can take this, right? So I understand how certain forms of work need to continue to take place while others come to a halt, basically, or are very dramatically reorganized. But then again, so that is the key tension, right? That from a feminist perspective, essential work is the work that is needed for life making, to use the type of definition that Tithi Bhattacharya, who's one of the main social reproduction theorists, uses. So whatever is needed in order to protect and sustain human life is essential. And it seemed that there was something around how governments were using those definitions that certainly had that element, because, for example, the need for health care workers and in some cases social care workers to continue to work, I think was very much determined by that. But then when we started looking at these definitions and we realized that across the 7 countries we looked at, actually there was a very little, they had very little in common. So like the categories that were in common across the 7 countries were very few. Then we began to explore then the reasons why there were these discrepancies. And then it turned out that not only the reason is that, the process of life making, if you accept this kind of description, is context specific, but that in fact, those definitions were incredibly political and politicized, and they were much more ambiguous than what one could have thought at the beginning. And so what emerged was that in many countries, that process of political negotiation around what was meant to be considered essential and what was meant to be considered non-essential were actually very overt. So for example, in Italy, the definition of essential workers changed multiple times. And that had to do with the negotiations between the state, the representatives of the employers, and the trade unions. So that tells that clearly what was at stake was not only the protection of human life, but it was also the protection of some key segments or the most powerful segments of capital. And I think that this is what underpins some of the major discrepancies that we saw across the board. And yes, and so it shows that yes, maybe there is, well, it shows a couple of things, that in the current economic system, I think it's very difficult to disentangle life making from profit making in many ways, and that certainly governments have been exploiting these blurred lines as much as possible in order to protect a variety of interests. So I think I leave it there. I don't know if I answered satisfactorily, but yeah.
Very much, thank you.
We have several questions from students. I'll read one, then Sergio will read a few others. This comes from Carla Venetti. We write this paper before the commercialization of vaccine, looking at the way vaccine is development, commercialization, and campaign. Do you think that this pandemic has raised or amplified old questions about science and how we understand it? What about indigenous struggle and cosmology in this frame? Could you speak about a racialized image of what is and what we understand for science? How we build a post-pandemic world without reproducing the capitalist world we criticize right now? Well, these are big, or several questions together, but I think we should bring together this one of the others that Sergio has collected as well. But my
Yes.
connection is a bit unstable. I might be cut short.
Mauricio doesn't have a good connection, and I don't have a good voice today because of I'm recovering from a cold. But I hope I can read the questions. And some of them are connected to the questions Mauricio has just read. So the first one sent by our first group of students, considering the economic, social, and political pressure that COVID-19 has created upon the states, how do you assess the future role of the welfare state in relation to different configurations of politics that emerge across the world around different conceptions of more equal society? Can social and political movements benefit from this ongoing degradation of the neoliberal conception of the state? And perhaps a further question, and then we can leave the second group of questions for the next round. So the next question, in your article, the group means this introduction to this spatial issue. You also talk briefly about the impact of the pandemic on the climate crisis, and that this once again opened our eyes to how we are dependent on nature. However, my observation was also that during the pandemic, many people did not focus on the climate crisis as much. The state also had other priorities and had to redistribute its expenditure. The climate crisis was, so to speak, neglected. On the other hand, as you have also described, we have seen how quickly the state can intervene if it wants to. For instance, less air traffic. This has also made many climate activists angry. I find this connection between pandemic, climate crisis, and capitalism very exciting. Could you say some more about this? And could the experience of the pandemic not perhaps also have a positive impact on future climate policy? So perhaps we leave the questions now for this, and then we have a second group of questions coming from the students.
Yeah, that is great. These are pretty, big and fundamental questions from your students. So that's, I mean, it's always very nice to hear that students are thinking along these very big lines, and instead of concerning themselves with questions that are a little bit too narrow, they are actually thinking about the big picture. I think that this is great. So I will do my best, although I will tell you that I don't think that I can answer very comprehensively on all of the issues that were raised. But to the first question that was written in the chat on vaccines and science. So the one thing that I would say is that, yeah, absolutely. So we did write this work before the full developments around vaccines distribution. And I forgot that earlier, but I think that is another key dimension of the South-North divides that we were talking about. I mean, even though I use these global South or global North divides, I am aware that the concepts or the definitions of global South and global North come with a lot of limitations. But in a way, I don't know if you've seen, I should have included that in the presentation, but those maps of the world that were circulating at some point showing vaccine distribution across the world, I've never seen anything neater when it comes to South-North divides. So I think it is very clear that the way in which the science around the vaccines has worked very much reproduces not only those divides, but in fact the sort of Eurocentric or Anglo-American centric sort of approach in how we think about science. And I'm afraid I don't know too much about indigenous cosmologies, but I think that there is something around thinking about how vaccine development, for example, can be remapped on a global scale that would create a space or some space for for a more equal distribution of vaccines, but also medicines more broadly across the globe. So I'm afraid I cannot say much more on this, but I think that there is something to the question that was asked, and it is certainly an area that is very important, particularly as we think that unfortunately pandemics are more likely to to occur unless we fundamentally change the way we do things, which should be a priority, but of course it takes time for that. The second question on the future role of the welfare state towards a more equal societies. So I think this is interesting because I mentioned this probably briefly in the presentation, that yes, in a way the state, we've discovered that the state can intervene very quickly and can be a very powerful actor if it wants to be that. And it was very impressive because we were not used to see that for a very long time. But I think it is also important to recognize that the capacity of the state to intervene meaningfully in the economy is very different depending on context. So there are many countries where actually the state was not able to do very much at all. And I think we need to be cognizant of these differences because they go back to global financial architecture system, where for some countries it's much more difficult to finance themselves. So this is something that needs to be in the picture. But in terms of the future role of the welfare state, I think particularly for those contexts where governments were able to intervene, what we're seeing is that we are probably entering a phase of capitalism where we need the state intervention because either wages are not sufficient to make a living, or because there are events such as pandemics, and the climate crisis is likely to reinforce this. So I think that it is likely that we're moving towards a phase where I'm not sure that what we would see is a return of the welfare state as such, but what we are likely to see in the countries that can afford to do that is a much more intervention state, because there are many areas of fragility where actually the state will have to intervene somehow. So I think we will see that. But then again, the opportunity to take this forward in a very progressive and transformative way, I think is more in the hands of indeed the social and political movements that the question was also mentioning. So in those initiatives that are more bottom up, I am, more hopeful, and I'm more optimistic on the, on change that comes from the grassroots and from the bottom in this context. And then finally, the question on the climate crisis and how, yes, absolutely, the COVID-19 crisis has shown that we are more dependent on nature. So I do not work very specifically on the climate crisis, but I can share with you something that my colleague at SOAS, who works on climate change, has been saying since the beginning of the pandemic, is that in a way, the way in which we responded to the COVID-19 crisis could be a test to how we are able to respond to the climate crisis. And we have not done very well on that test because, yes, we have, in some cases, the responses have been fairly fast, but then they have not been particularly radical, or in fact, they haven't been radical at all. And what the climate crisis needs is that kind of very strong, immediate action that is also very radically transformative. And I think that we're not quite getting there. So again, more is needed on that front. And I would again sort of emphasize the role of social and political movements to take matters in their own hands and try to push that kind of change forward. Yeah.
Thank you. I have just, let's see.
Mariana has a question as well. She could ask that, and then you continue. We have still 8 minutes or so.
Yeah, but doesn't Sergio have
question that Mariana has collected, and we could use.
I thought Sergio had more student questions too, don't you?
Yes.
Yes.
So,
but you want me to go first?
Yes, and then Sergio complements them.
Okay. So this is Danielle's question. Okay. As part of the inequalities in the global south caused by pandemics, it has had an increase in domestic violence and pregnancy among young women. How do you think this is interconnected with the exploitation of the social reproduction in houseworks?
Shall I come back now, or are we taking more?
I think now we could have Sergio's questions, and then you answer all of them because you don't have much time anyway.
Okay.
That's fine. I'm happy to collect all of them. Yeah.
Thank you. I also passed the questions in our internal chat, so you can also follow it, because I don't trust my voice today. So, but I will just read the questions for those who are not seeing the questions in the chat. So this is the question sent by Checkho and group. So using the statement as example representative of the overarching idea supported by you and the authors of this introduction, and I quote, overall, despite the unprecedented economic and social consequences of the pandemic, the status quo that is reflected in the global financial architecture, it puts the global south in a subordinate position, has not been changed, let alone changed. Could you say that there is a deliberate move to keep the Global South in that position for easy exploitation, or would a framework of path of least resistance explain better the power dynamics observed between the two regions? In other words, are the motivations behind the worsening of relations originating in strategic ponderation or nonchalant neglect? And the next question, what long-lasting policies and social cultural shifts would be necessary in order to change the situation for the better? So this is also broad questions, but perhaps you can give us some insights on both. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much to all of these students again. So on the question of whether this is, the sort of the divides between the South and the North are being reproduced strategically and intentionally, or whether this is just happening out of neglect or inertia, I think it's the former, in that I think that these divides are not there by coincidence, so to speak, but in a way, these inequalities on a global scale and the hierarchies in terms of that are very visible in terms of the global division of labor, for example, who does what on a global scale, have been fundamental. So they are a core ingredient of the functioning of the economic system that we have. So in a way, these divides are necessary for the continuation of the system. So I don't think, when I say intentional, it's not that I think that there is a group of people in a dark room somewhere deciding that this is going to be the case, but it happens organically through the protection of certain interests, and protecting those interests entail keeping some countries, some social groups in a position of subordination, so to speak. And so this is how I would address that question. And clearly what has happened so far is that we do not see the political will among the politics with the big P to try to think or create a system that works differently. And so in terms of the long-lasting policies and social cultural shifts that would be necessitated, I mean, this is, this is a very sort of long and difficult journey, so to speak. But it goes from anything that has to do with education and all of the agendas towards or for decolonization, but the real decolonization, not like the buzzword, the decolonization that now we hear a lot about. And again, I think that the role of social and political movements, but also labor organizations or trade unions and so forth, should be quite central in putting forward an alternative vision for a more equal, sustainable, and caring economy for the future. So there is a lot of work to be done, and it's up to, I imagine, young people such as the students in the audience to take forward some of this work. And then I wanted to answer the question that Mariana put to me, which I took some very partial notes. So was it about, can you please repeat the question maybe? Sorry about that.
Yeah, it's right here. It's on my phone. It's in my phone. As part of the inequalities in the global South caused by pandemics, one of them, right, was an increase in domestic violence and pregnancy among young women. How do you think this is, or is this, right, interconnected with the exploitation of social reproduction and houseworks, or domestic labor?
Yeah. So thank you. So yeah, I think that there is a connection, and then again, it's not specific to the COVID-19 pandemic, although the COVID-19 pandemic might have exacerbated this for sure. That has to do with the fact that the devaluation of social reproduction work has effectively put women in a subordinate position. And the fact that women are in a subordinate position, both economically and socially, is to do with, things such as domestic violence against the women, and the fact that, there is this attempt at exercising control over women, including over the bodies of women. Although, of course, then there is this important conversations and debates also among feminists that some of these patriarchal relations that clearly underpin domestic violence, gender domestic violence, predate the current economic system that we have, predate capitalism. So, but I think that there is certainly an interplay between the capitalist system and the patriarchy, and the two systems tend to reinforce one another. So if you put it in the context of COVID, I would trace that connection the way I put it. Yeah.
Sara, thank you very much. We have run out of time, but you had a very interesting discussion. Your presentation raised a lot of questions, and I think the students were very bold in the issues they raised. We hope we'll be in contact again at some point to carry on with the discussion. Thank you very much, Sergio, Mariana, and sorry for the connection. Sometimes it's very good, sometimes it's very bad. So I don't know why it happened today, but anyway, I hope to see you all soon.
Yeah, thank you so much to all of you. This was great, and so thank you so much for organizing. And I hope that we can continue to be in touch. Actually,
definitely.
Thank
you very much.
Yeah, and